4 women, 1 inmate, all pregnant at the same time. But believe me, that's not even the strangest part of this story. In late 2012, FBI agents, listening to a wiretap, recorded a single sentence that would send shivers down the spine of every prison administrator in America. "This is my jail. I make every final call in here." The man speaking wasn't a warden. He wasn't a corrections officer. He wasn't even a free man. He was an inmate locked inside Baltimore City Detention Center, awaiting trial for attempted murder. So, how does a man with no keys, no cash, and no official power manage to pull in $15,800 in a single month from inside a concrete cell? A scathing federal indictment alleged that a group of corrupt corrections officers and gang members inside the Baltimore City Detention Center smuggled in drugs and cell phones. That indictment named 25 people. The indictment detailed a system with few controls, involving texts, drugs, and wiretaps. Female officers were having sex with prison inmates, and prison officials were willing to look the other way. How did he manage to provide luxury cars, like a BMW and a Mercedes-Benz, to the very women paid to guard him? And perhaps the question that should haunt every American taxpayer is, how did the federal government miss an entire criminal empire operating right under their nose for nearly 4 years? His name was Tavon White. He was known on the streets as Bulldog. And what you're about to hear will change the way you look at the American prison system forever. To understand what Tavon White built, you have to understand where he built it. In the summer of 2009, the temperature inside Baltimore City Detention Center hit 40 degrees Celsius. There was no air conditioning, and broken plumbing leaked into the hallways. The entire facility reeked like an alley that hadn't been hosed down in a decade. 750 men were crammed into a building older than the light bulb, and somewhere in that mess, a legend was about to be born. Locals called the place the Castle. Built in 1859, it loomed over East Eager Street like a medieval stone monster, with Gothic towers and iron-barred windows watching over downtown Baltimore. Beautiful from the outside, it was a nightmare on the inside. Summers turned the upper tiers into a furnace, winters dropped them into cold storage. The cells were barely bigger than closets, often packed with 2 men breathing the same stale air. Then there were the people supposed to keep order. Most of them were women, young, underpaid, pulled off the street with barely a few weeks of training before being handed a uniform and dropped into a building full of predators who studied human weakness the way Wall Street studies stocks. They were never trained for psychological manipulation, nor for the challenges that lay ahead. But here's what nobody wants to admit: corruption didn't start with Tavon White. It was already there. Corruption was already rampant, cigarettes exchanged for favors, cell phones for cash, and guards routinely looking the other way, as confrontation was rarely deemed worth the paperwork. White didn't create the rot, he just became the first man to look at it and see the blueprint for an empire. And he wasn't the first to try. Years before Tavon ever walked through those gates, another BGF leader named Eric Marcel Brown had written an actual book on how to run the gang from inside prison walls. Tavon learned from him, every word of it. Tavon White grew up on the east side of Baltimore, in neighborhoods where the line between success and ruin often depended on who you knew and how quickly you learned. He joined the Black Guerrilla family young. By the time the police slapped the cuffs on him in 2009 for attempted murder, he was already wearing the colors. Most people thought that arrest was the end of his story. It was just the beginning, because while the other inmates were counting days, Tavon White was counting people, who looked scared, who avoided eye contact, which guard lingered a second too long when he spoke, which one laughed too loud at his jokes. He read that jail the way a chess player reads a board, 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The lonely ones, the unappreciated ones, the ones who came home to empty apartments and bills they couldn't pay. He saw them all, and he remembered street psychology. That's what they call it in East Baltimore. You don't learn it in a classroom, you learn it on a corner where misreading a man's face can cost you your life. But Tavon needed more than instinct. He needed a blueprint, and that came from Eric Marcel Brown. Eric Marcel Brown, the original commander of the BGF in Maryland, was incarcerated in a different facility, yet he managed to run the gang from his own cell. Brown had achieved something no Baltimore gangster had ever done before. He wrote a book, which they called the Black Book. Part manifesto, part operations manual, part recruitment pitch, it taught younger members how to organize, how to discipline, and how to turn a prison into a corporation. Tavon studied it like scripture. He started building his circle. His right-hand man was Jamar Anderson, known on the streets as Hammer for reasons that needed no explanation. Then there was Joseph Young, known as Monster, a name that would prove significant in ways Tavon couldn't foresee. Together, they ran the tiers. They settled disputes before knives came out. They kept the chaos manageable. And then it happened, the moment that changed everything. Tavon White realized the guards were trusting him more than they trusted their own supervisors. They approached him when fights erupted, asking him to de-escalate tensions. And here's the part nobody at the top wanted to admit, the administration knew. They saw it happening. They just needed the peace too badly to stop it. Which brings us to the question that still keeps prison reformers up at night: how does a man with no keys, no legal authority, and not a single dollar in his pocket convince 4 women, paid by the state of Maryland to guard him, to carry his children? It began with Jennifer Owens, 31 years old, the pioneer who opened a door that none of the others would have dared to walk through had she not gone first. She started small, a pack of cigarettes here, a little marijuana tucked into her uniform there. Nothing happened. Nobody noticed. And the longer nothing happened, the bolder she got. By the time the FBI pulled her records, Owens had the name Tavon inked across her neck like a brand. She wasn't hiding it anymore, she was advertising it. Then came Katara Stevenson, 24, the quietest of the 4. She kept her head down, spoke in short sentences, and did her job. But the other inmates noticed. Her eyes followed Bulldog every time he walked past her station. She would slip boxes of Suboxone strips inside her shoes, walking them through metal detectors that inexplicably never seemed to catch anything, then hand them off in quick exchanges that were easily missed if you weren't paying close attention. She got Tavon's name tattooed, too, on her wrist this time. Shania Brooks, 27, was the one who received the ring. She hid pills under her waistband and controlled specific doors that opened at certain times, doors that should have remained locked. She wasn't reckless like Owens, she was useful. And Tavon rewarded usefulness with jewelry that cost more than her monthly paycheck. Then there was Tiffany Lender, also 27, arguably the smartest of them all. She smuggled cell phones, the most valuable contraband in the building, tucking them into her hair and other places nobody was authorized to search. But her real value wasn't in what she carried, it was in what she heard. FBI agents would later catch Tavon on a wiretap saying, "I just got a message from Lender. They're pulling a shakedown tonight." She became his early warning system, his eyes within the administration. Here's what people miss about how this happened: Tavon never threatened these women. He never had to. The first woman helped him, and when nothing bad came of it, word spread. The second watched the first receive gifts, attention, and someone who genuinely listened to her at the end of a long shift. The third saw the second, the fourth saw the third. It was a domino, and Tavon didn't push the pieces, he just stood there and let them fall toward him. Then something flipped. Somewhere around 2011, it wasn't Tavon White chasing these women anymore, they were competing for him. Jealousy crept onto the tiers. Who got the BMW? Who got the Mercedes-Benz? Who got the diamond ring? 2 of them even had his name tattooed onto their bodies in permanent ink, a bizarre loyalty contest rarely seen outside of cults. The other inmates saw it, they whispered. The other guards saw it, too, and some of them looked the other way because saying something meant becoming a target. By 2012, the pregnancies couldn't be hidden anymore. Their uniforms grew tighter. Doctors' notes circulated. Co-workers did the math and arrived at the same impossible answer. And here's the detail that took years to come out: one of those 4 women became pregnant not once, but twice, resulting in a total of 5 children from 4 women. All born to corrections officers paid by the state to keep Tavon White locked away from the public. In a slow month, Tavon White cleared $15,800. Let that sink in. That was more than the annual take-home pay of some of the corrections officers walking past his cell every day. Here's how he pulled it off. The supply chain started outside the walls and ran straight through the front gate of BCDC, in the uniforms of the women already in love with him. Cigarettes were the entry-level product, marked up to 10 times their street value because nicotine cravings don't negotiate. Marijuana brought a steadier flow of cash. But the real money was in Suboxone strips. Slipped into shoes, bras, and even hairlines, they were highly profitable because inmates struggling with heroin withdrawal would pay almost anything to alleviate their suffering. Then there were the cell phones, the crown jewels of his operation. Wrapped in plastic, tucked into hair buns, they were walked past metal detectors that nobody bothered to calibrate. Every phone inside the building meant another direct line to a dealer on the corner, a girlfriend on the couch, or a customer unknowingly being drawn into the operation. But contraband is only half the business. You still have to move the money. And this is where Tavon got smart in a way the feds didn't see coming for years. Green dot prepaid debit cards became his solution. Easily purchased at any 7-Eleven, drugstore, or gas station in America, cash could be loaded onto a card, and the card number relayed over a smuggled cell phone. Done. No bank account, no paper trail, no federal regulator looking over your shoulder. A person in Baltimore could load $500 onto a card at a CVS, call the number into the jail, and Tavon's outside crew would have product on the street within an hour. The cards moved millions through the system before anyone in law enforcement understood what was happening. Every week, inmates say, Tavon held what they came to call town hall meetings. He sat down on a folding chair. He listened to complaints. He settled debts. He set the rules: who paid what, who answered to whom, which fights were sanctioned and which ones earned you a beating from your own crew. He ran it with the precision of a Fortune 500 CEO conducting a quarterly review. The only difference was that this CEO was orchestrating a criminal enterprise inside a state-owned building, funded by Maryland taxpayers. And here's the part that still makes federal investigators uncomfortable when you ask them about it: remarkably, while Tavon White was running BCDC, violence on the tiers actually decreased. Stabbings dropped, and fights were broken up before they could escalate. Inmates were, in fact, safer under the rule of a convicted criminal than they were under the official management of the state of Maryland. The administration didn't want to say it out loud, but the numbers said it for them. By now, you might be thinking I'm exaggerating. Fair enough. A story this wild deserves to be questioned. So, let's separate what the courts actually proved from what the internet decided was true. Sex was so prevalent inside the jail that BGF leader Tavon White fathered children with 4 different female officers. 2 had his name tattooed on their bodies. Corrections officer Jennifer Owens was heard to say, "I understand you're stressed out, 'cause you're locked up, but I am, too. You locked up and I'm pregnant again. Who does that?" White admitted to the jury that he had engaged in sexual relationships with several corrections officers and had fathered children while incarcerated. While online blogs might claim Tavon White was sleeping with 11 different corrections officers, court records reveal otherwise: for pregnancies and a handful of additional relationships, nowhere near 11. Similarly, while Wikipedia rabbit holes might suggest he fathered a dozen children inside that jail, federal prosecutors confirmed the number at 5. Not more, not less. 5. You'll hear people claim he ran every BGF cell from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore. That was only half right. He was the commander of BGF inside BCDC, not the citywide shot caller some podcasters made him out to be. However, when people claim the entire jail was bought and paid for, the courts largely concurred. 24 corrections officers were eventually convicted. 24. That's not merely a few bad apples, that's a systemic failure. And then there's the money. While street rumors suggested Tavon was pulling in millions, wiretaps and bank records indicated his best month yielded $15,800. He himself stated on a recorded line, "My profit was $15,800 and something, or $16,400 something. That ain't bad for a whole month." It was significant money for a man in a cell, certainly not Pablo Escobar money, but a substantial profit from selling smuggled drugs and phones, according to the indictment. Here's the thing about legends, the facts shrink, and the myth grows. Walk through certain corners of East Baltimore today, and you'll still hear his name in rap lyrics, in barbershop arguments, and in podcasts recorded in bedrooms. To some young men out there, Bulldog is a cautionary tale. To others, he's a blueprint. What none of them knew back when the empire was at its peak was that somebody was already listening. Somebody who didn't say a word for months, recording every call, mapping every transaction, waiting for the right moment to bring the whole thing down. The first cracks appeared back in 2009, the same year Tavon White walked into BCDC in handcuffs. Federal agents, operating 2 facilities away, were closing in on his mentor, Eric Marcel Brown, the author of The Black Book and the architect of BGF Maryland. Brown was swept up in a separate racketeering case that brought down 24 people with him. The feds didn't know it yet, but Brown's arrest was the loose thread. The investigators who picked it up couldn't stop pulling. Cell phones continued to appear in Maryland jails where they shouldn't have been. Patterns began to emerge, calls originating from inside the walls to street corners across Baltimore. Someone was clearly orchestrating a large-scale operation. By late 2012, the FBI's Baltimore field office had heard enough. They made a decision that would change everything. They were going to tap the smuggled cell phones inside BCDC, phones the inmates assumed were untouchable. Over the next 3 months, agents recorded thousands of calls. The recordings were so damning, so detailed, and so brazen that the Baltimore office had to bring in extra analysts just to keep up with the transcripts. They weren't just hearing a smuggling operation, they were hearing a corporation. And then, they heard it, the sentence that would become the headline of every news story about this case. Tavon White, on a recorded line, discussing a dispute on the tiers with another BGF member, stated with the chilling calm of a man who had forgotten anyone could be listening, "This is my jail. I make every final call in here." It wasn't a boast, that's what sent chills down the agent's spines. It was a statement of fact. He believed it because, in his reality, it was true. And in that moment, the supervising agent on the case knew they didn't need more evidence. They had a confession on tape. They just had to build the rest of the case around it. They began mapping the hierarchy, Tavon White at the top, Jamar Anderson, Hammer, as his enforcer, Joseph Young, Monster, circling for the throne, the 4 pregnant officers feeding the pipeline. Below them was a layer of guards, the lookouts, the gate openers, those who tipped off shakedowns. Then came the outside suppliers and kitchen workers. It was a web of 24 corrections officers and 20 more co-conspirators that resembled less a prison scandal and more the organizational chart of a multinational company. On April 23, 2013, at 6 o'clock in the morning, federal agents staged at 12 locations across Baltimore. Homes, apartments, a few cars and driveways with engines still warm. Warrants in hand, doors were about to come off their hinges. Within hours, Tavon White's empire would be dismantled. But even as the first agent stepped onto front porches, raising their fists to knock, the man at the center of it all had no idea what was coming. The doors came down at dawn. By the end of that morning, 25 people were in federal custody, and the indictment kept growing. Within months, the number climbed to 44, inmates, corrections officers, suppliers, kitchen staff. Tavon White himself was pulled from his cell with the same calm he had displayed on every wiretap. He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he already knew. What nobody expected was what came next. Tavon White, the self-proclaimed king of BCDC, the man whose name was tattooed on women's bodies, the commander whom tears full of men called Sir, sat down with federal prosecutors and started talking. In the BGF code, what he did was the worst sin imaginable: cooperation, snitching. He named names. He explained the entire pipeline. He sat on the witness stand and described the affairs, the beatings, the whole intricate machine. Under the deal he cut, his federal time would run concurrently with his state sentence. He chose mathematics over loyalty. The judge sentenced him to 12 years federal and 20 years state, served concurrently. Of the 44 defendants, 40 were convicted, 24 of whom were corrections officers in uniforms paid for by Maryland taxpayers. 2 years later, the governor permanently shut down the men's side of BCDC. By 2021, the castle on East Eager Street was reduced to rubble. But Tavon White's story didn't die with the building. It lives on in Baltimore rap verses, in true crime podcasts, and in the training rooms where federal agents teach the next generation how to spot a prison empire before it grows. He proved something the American government still doesn't want to say out loud: when the official system collapses, power always finds a way to fill the empty space. And here's what almost nobody talks about: after Tavon left, another man stepped into that vacuum, smarter, quieter, harder to catch. That story is coming next. Make sure to follow along so you don't miss it.